Okay, in this video lesson, what we're going to do is take a look at creating our first application using wxWidgets.
Yay.
It's just going to be a simple window, and the title bar is going to say, I don't know, Hello World. Yeah, since that's what everybody does for our first application, we figured we'd conform to standards for learning programming languages. So anyways, now that all that's out of the way, what we're going to show you is how to go about setting up a new project and then creating the window itself.
That's right. So let's go up to File, go to New, and Project. You've kind of done this before in previous VTMs, but it's going to be a little bit different. Select Win32 project. You'll remember before we selected console project. This time Win32 project. And under the name, we'll just call this Hello World app. Okay.
Sounds good.
And let's just press OK for this. And under application settings, just like before, we'll say empty project, so it doesn't create code for us. And we'll just press finish. And under the source files directory, let's go ahead and add a new item, and we'll just call this Hello World. So this is where we're going to be entering all our source code, of course. But first, we're going to need to set it up so that this project knows where to reference all the files and that kind of thing.
Right, for the wxWidgets thing.
Right.
Because right now it has no clue.
Well, it has some clue of where the include files and the library files are.
Yeah, sure. Try to compile it with and see if it has a clue.
But some of the header files are still project dependent.
That's right.
We need to go in here and right-click and say Properties. And as you can see, we have lots and lots of properties. But the first thing we're going to need to do is go to the preprocessor section here. And preprocessor definitions, these are things that, commands if you will, that are sent to the compiler when it's compiling your application to say what to include. As you can see here, it says Win32, Windows, so it's compiling for Windows type applications, and underscore debug, so that when you're debugging your application, Windows specific stuff will be debugged, etc. So we need to add a few things to here just to make debugging wxWidgets a little bit easier. First thing is wxUse GUI is equal to 1. So that says we are in fact using a GUI. So that's cool. Another thing is we're going to have to say wxDebug. So that means we're actually debugging wxWidgets. So when we compile apps, it's going to be in debug mode, if you will. And finally, although it seems rather repetitive, we also have wxDebug equals to 1. So this is another kind of way to say that we're debugging our application. So aside from that, we're also going to need to go to the linker. Code generation and runtime library. .NET comes with a runtime library that handles basic functions like adding integers, multiplying integers, that kind of thing. By default, wxWidgets links with the multi-threaded DLL version of this. So we're going to just select multi-threaded debug DLL. For people that have no clue what a DLL is or any of that kind of thing, don't worry about it. Just accept it as a fact. Now, if we go to the linker folder, we're also going to need to change a little bit here. If we go to the input directory, we have additional dependencies. Now, what this means is, remember we have all those libraries, like the WX, MSW, etc.
Right.
It needs to know which libraries it uses.
It does.
It knows the location of them, but we just need to say which ones to actually use.
Right.
So let's go into here and say wxmswd.lib. Remember, the D at the end means this is a debug library.
That's right.
If we remove that, that would be the release, but since we're working with the debug configuration, we want it to be D.
Right. Now, of course, this is going to be much happier.
Yes. Some other things that wxmswd relies on is common controls 32.lib. This is Windows specific, so basically this one is holding things like, you have the load file dialog, you have the save file dialog, that kind of thing. That's held in that. And we have this one as well. You do not need to worry about this one, but it needs it as well. And finally, we have WS, the WinSock 32.lib.
Internet type stuff.
Right. So with that should be everything. But one more thing, I almost forgot, but I didn't. Additional include directories. Remember, we have the setup.h file. Well, the header files, the wx.h header file, is going to need that setup.h file. So we're going to need to specify where that is. The only reason we did not set it up in the global directories option is this is also project type dependent. So we have a debug setup.h and a release setup.h. So if we come over to C program files and just kind of go up here, remember our library file? It copied over depending on which release we have. Under the MSWD, which is the debug one, we have a setup.h. It needs to know where that setup.h is. So let's go ahead and copy this path right here. Go back to .NET here, paste this in. Now it knows where it is.
Yeah, now everything's going to be much happier when you go to compile.
Oh, yes. No more millions and millions of linking errors.
Sure, it may have known a little bit about wxWidgets ahead of time.
That's right.
It still would not have compiled.
It still would have been, whoo, what do I do?
Exactly.
So now we have everything set up. Now, there are some commercial products that allow to kind of simplify this process, because it is kind of a pain in the neck to set this up every single time. One commonly used way is just to copy an existing project, change a few of the properties, and then it's all set up, which is typically what I do. If you have the money to spend, or if you're working at a company where they kind of freely distribute it, where they have the money to spend,
that's right.
There are commercial products that create wizards so that you can create a wxWidgets project just with a few clicks of a button, which is awesome, but only if you have the money. So anyways, first thing, let's include the wx/wx.h. So wx.h. So this is the main header file that we're going to need. Now, for a project to work with wxWidgets, we need basically two things. We have the main application, which is the wx app, and we also have wx frame, which is actually what we see. wx app is kind of the starting point for the entire application. You usually don't need much code there, but wx frame is what we actually see, and that's pretty much where you're going to be putting most of the code. So let me just come on over to Adobe Reader right here, and don't let this scare you. This is pretty much just a diagram of all the different classes that wxWidget has. And you can see that everyone is a subclass of wxObject, so that's the daddy class of everything else. And if you come down, actually, let me just go back up here. We have wxApp right up here, which is the starting point for all applications. And if we come down here, right under wxControl, we have wxFrame. And under wxFrame, we have different children that allow you to do, say, MDI, which is multiple document interface. So you have multiple windows inside one window, etc. In this case, we're just going to use a regular wxFrame. So that kind of just gives you a general idea of the relationship. If we go back here now, let's go ahead and create the main guy, the wx app, which is the starting point. So we create a new class, Hello World App, if I could spell, and it's going to inherit from wx app. Now we only need to overload one function inside of here, and we want it to be at the start. And there's a virtual function that we need to overload called onInit. So let's say virtual. Thank you. It returns a boolean, true or false, and the function is called onInit. So this function is going to automatically be called when the application is initialized, and inside that function is where we'll create the instance of wxFrame, our main window. So with that, the other thing we need to do is call a macro called implement_app, and then we'll just pass it the name of our class. This basically sets up the no semicolon there. This basically sets up the calling so that this is the first thing that's called. Because otherwise, by default, void main, as we did before, or when you're creating Win32 applications, it would be win main.
Right.
So that's the main thing that's called. This basically is a macro that creates a bunch of code behind the scenes that allows win main to be called first, which calls wxWidgets.
Yeah,
so wxWidgets handles everything.
Exactly. For those of you guys out there that haven't watched any of the previous VTMs, we have talked about macros.
Yes, I think we have.
I think so too. And that basically, macros just a way of simply representing a lot of code
right.
with a single name.
Yeah, it makes coding a whole lot more simple.
Yes, it does.
Because we don't really want to see what's going on behind the scenes. This kind of just blocks that off from us.
Right.
So with that said, all we need to do now is create the onInit function. So it's going to be the member of Hello World. And inside of here, all we need to do is create the actual window. So we're going to create a wxFrame, and we'll just call this frame, and create a new instance of wxFrame. And then we just pass it the parameters. The first one is going to be the parent. Well, this is the main window, so it's not going to need a parent, right? So we're just going to we're going to cast it to wxFrame pointer, because that's what it's looking for. But it's just going to be null. No parent.
Because there's no parent,
right? The second one here is basically the
Windows ID.
The window ID, right? Which says what's your name, basically. And in this case, since we're kind of the main parent, we don't need a name, so we just set it to -1, which is the default. Then we're going to set the caption, the thing that's displayed on the top.
Unicode.
And this little macro here is basically allows us to set the string that we're passing, the constant string, to be Unicode or regular. And by using this macro, this project can be used as either Unicode or regular. When you recompile, it automatically decides which. Now, for those of you that don't know, Unicode is basically just the way of representing, say, Asian characters, which require 2 bytes instead of just 1. So with this macro, it's kind of hard for me to remember, but just try to always remember to put the _T before it.
So here comes our Windows title.
Hello World. It's the heart of the application right there.
Okay.
So after we have the caption, we need to set the position where the window is going to be and the size of the window. So wxPoint, this is another class that specifies an x and a y. So we're going to pass it, let's say, 60 across and 70 down. Then finally we need to specify the size of the window. So wx size and the width and the height. So let's say a width of 500 and a height of 600.
That's a big old window.
Yes, it is. And so ended off with that. Now we've created the class. We created the instance of the class. Now we need to actually show it, because right now if it exits, it's just not going to see anything.
Well, it's just sitting there.
It's just sitting there. That's right. So what we need to do is say frame, and then remember arrow, and then we'll pass it show, which means display this window. We'll just pass it true, which means we do really want to show it. And finally we'll say set top window frame. So it's going to set this new frame that we just created to the top so we see it. Finally we just return true, saying that the application ran fine, happy, happy, all done. So if we set up everything right, and I didn't make any typos, everything should work. So if we come up to build solution, give it a second, it's linking.
Nice.
Very nice, no errors. So if we go ahead and run this by just pressing Control F5, look at that. We have a Hello World window. Very, very fancy.
What kind of functionality do you have?
It has ability to exit, minimize, and maximize.
Wow, and you can resize.
And I can resize the window, as you can see here. I can just resize. Yes, very nice. Eh?
And up here in your title bar, upper left hand.
Yeah, very special.
Pretty fancy, and it did not require a whole lot of code to pull that off.
Yeah, that's kind of what I want people to see is if you use regular Win32 API, just to do this simple example would require a whole lot more code.
A whole lot more.
Yeah, so this simplifies your life a lot.
And if you think this is confusing or cryptic looking, yeah, try doing it with just regular Win API.
That's right. One last thing I do want to specify or talk about is the last parameter that we can put in here is the style of the window. Say, for instance, if you don't want a minimize button or you don't want the window to be able to be resized. Now, this is where the help file comes in, because there's a lot of constants. So if we come down here, you notice that I already have it set to wx frame. And you see, by default, it puts in wx default frame style, which says wx minimize box. It kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
You want to minimize box.
Maximize.
You want to maximize, and you want it to be resizable.
Right.
You want there to be a caption.
Menu.
Yep, a system menu.
Up left for corner.
And so on and so forth. So by combining these yourself, you can decide how you want your window to look. So if I just copy this for a second, just copy that all. Let me minimize that. And let me just come over to here. And let's say we want it to have no minimize box.
Okay.
But we want everything else to be the same. So we just cut that entire style out here and just add that to here.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's all the styles we want for this window. Now if we rebuild this, let's give it another second. Don't forget to close the application, otherwise I can't create a new one. So let's just relink it. And if we run it, check it out. The minimize button has now been disabled. Now, a more simple style to do this, because it's kind of ugly to do this, I don't want to go into coding styles or anything, but typically what you would do is you just take all of this here and just call it, say, L style, and we'll create a variable called long L style, and we'll just equate it to that. Kind of simpler looking code.
For sure.
And that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in this lesson. I just wanted to show you guys how simple it is to create a simple application and go ahead and start using wxWidgets.
Awesome. Okay, and so with that, it's going to wrap up this lesson. Thanks.